hi everybody who's here. I'm going to begin with a little note on the festival and then about the authors who are here with us, and then we'll start. So this is a panel discussion at the Long Weekend of Literatures 2021. The theme is Belonging Beyond Borders. And the Long Weekend is brought to you by 11 partnering European countries and their cultural institutions, the European Union, the EU, NIC, and Belong. I'm Urmi Bhattacheryya. I'm an independent journalist and author of the book After I Was Raped. We have with us today Kübra Gümüşay and Nilanjana S. Roy. Kübra was born in Hamburg in 1988 and studied political science in Hamburg and London. She's the author of the best-selling book Sprache und Schein, Language and Being, and the founder of several award-winning campaigns and associations. For example, the campaign Shaheen Against Racism, the Feminist Alliance Osnamslos, and the campaign Organized Love. In 2018, Forbes magazine selected her as one of 30 under 30 in Europe in the media and marketing industry. Nilanjana is the author of 2 fantasy novels, the award-winning The Wildlings and The 100 Names of Darkness, and is the editor of several anthologies, including Our Freedoms. She writes a regular column on books for the Financial Times. Her third novel, Black River, will be published in 2022. Welcome, Nilanjana and Kübra. Did I get all of that right? Was there anything I mispronounced?
It was perfect. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction.
Wonderful. Thanks. So about the discussion itself, it's going to be women, innovation, and the internet, as Lasya mentioned. We'll be discussing the voice of women on the internet. Essentially, there are threats of violence, sexual harassment, mortal danger that are regularly levied against women who voice their opinions online. The gaze of social media heavily replicates the patriarchal gaze of the real world. And this gets particularly worse when gender intersects with more marginalized identity markers. So in this panel, we're going to explore those topics in depth. And to do that, we'll look to Nilanjana and Kübra to essentially ask them what their stand is on some of these issues. So Kübra, Nilanjana, I'm just going to start us off with, if you will, a primer question. You know, both of you navigate the internet, you do so regularly. And are there ways in which you feel unsafe, particularly, you know, because this is a digital space where you can't physically see your abuser or the person who's trolling you, and yet it's something where it's a space that we're constantly inhabiting. So is that a different kind of danger, and how do you most simplistically feel that danger on a daily basis?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for that introduction, Urmi. I was wondering, Kübra, would you like to go first?
You can go first, and I'll add. I'm happy with that. Whatever you prefer.
I'd be perfectly happy if you kick this off, but.
All right. So yeah, this is a very important question, and I think we could probably have just a debate on this question alone, since I feel the internet has changed us all. I mean, we're part of a global experiment, a social experiment where all of our habits are changing, the way we talk is changing. And to me, the internet is not just one factor in our lives, you know, like this small bit that is in addition to our lives, but it's an architecture we live in. And I think it's important to manifest this environment as a physical environment, because what's happening there, although it might be just words, although it might be just letters, a black and white, it still is physical violence, because when you talk to people who experience harassment, online harassment, threats that they receive online, it has a physical impact on their lives. It is felt physically, just as if you had asked your child how it feels about a certain thing that happened to them that was only through words, they would still say, my heart hurt. So it has a physical impact, and I would like to also highlight it as an architecture, because it changes the way we move through a room. It changes the way we highlight certain aspects of our lives and actually hide away other aspects. It makes us see certain things. So it has a lot of opportunities for us to connect, but it also creates barriers. It can put people in cages. It can suffocate us. And I find it highly difficult and problematic when people say, oh, just don't behave a certain way when we talk about a destructive discourse, for instance, or when we talk about how people consume certain media more or use a certain language more than others. And then we always put the blame on individuals and say, well, they don't use that word or don't consume it that way or don't behave that way, when this architecture actually shapes us to behave in a certain way. So it is like saying to someone, oh, if there was a huge door that was easy accessible and everyone is walking through that door, but by walking through that door, you actually walk on other people and maybe even kill a person. And then there's another very small, narrow door that it's very difficult to open and no one knows where the key is. And some people do know. And then you're like, oh, and you wouldn't kill anyone if you walk through that door. You wouldn't hurt anyone if you walk through that door. And then you put a blame on people and say, well, you could have walked through that door. Why did you walk through that other door? It is difficult to live in an environment where it's much easier to be hostile, polarized, provocative, and violent. And so we need to highlight the structural phenomena behind the violence that is happening online. We are all shaped by it. And the threats that women, especially women of color, outspoken, critical thinkers, oppositional people receive online is not just because people are inherently bad or what they say is provocative. It is because we all live in an environment where these kind of threats are normalized. And that is maybe one last point before I give over to Nilanjana, because I think this is a global conversation that has different forms all around the world. But what I see happening everywhere is that then the people who speak up, who do so out of love for the environment, for the climate, for nature, for other human beings, for the people they live with, for a better future, when these people are called controversial, I find it extremely critical and actually devastating to see how these people, just because of the hateful reactions they get, they are being called controversial when what they say is absolutely sound and absolutely constructive and important and valuable. And the people who receive this kind of threats and attacks, they are being labeled controversial rather than looking at the structure that puts people who stand up for justice be labeled as, weird or controversial or difficult, etc., etc. And this is how, in Germany at least, we have now come to discourse where people who save people who are drowning in the Mediterranean have to defend themselves rather than those who don't choose to help. And this is how a discourse changes, how we end up in societies where people who stand up for love, who stand up for justice, have to defend themselves rather than everyone else who supports injustice.
Kübra, thank you so much for that, because in that few brief minutes, I think you touched on both the potential of the internet for women, particularly, or for anyone who cares about justice, equality, a more fair and less hate-filled world, for example, and also the trouble, the peril of it. And I've been on the internet pretty much since the late 1990s. Apologies, I'm practically a dinosaur. And to me, the internet went in two phases. In the 1990s, I was a teenager and I stepped on the internet just not knowing what to expect. This was pretty much the World Wide Web. Right from the start, it was obvious that this was a space of tremendous potential freedom. Sitting in India, it allowed me almost instantly to connect first to book lovers abroad, and then to find what were then radical women's groups online, which were spaces of both tremendous safety and a great deal of potential. But as one does, you wander. And I got my first rape threat, I think, in the first week of being online. and the first death threat, pretty much in the first month of being online. So it was obvious the first experience of being doxxed, which is that whole thing where your address and details are made public, happened pretty fast as well. So right from the start, I was very well aware that this space was not entirely secure, that it was a parallel world and it had its own architecture, definitely. At that point of time, you had hubs and chat rooms, and you drew a map for yourself, more or less. I was also stepping on the internet with a tremendous amount of privilege in one direction. I spoke English. I come from very much upper caste India, and those things become weapons and shields. It was a much more hostile experience in the 1990s. For say, I don't think there were very many women from rural India who stepped online. So, right from the start, again, the class, caste, gender, race, religion, all of these things were in the mix. The second avatar, which is what we think of the internet today, Facebook, Twitter. I think even now, though, I live a lot on Twitter. I've more or less abandoned Facebook. I'm there briefly on Instagram as a kind of diary thing. And every time I see women or non-binary people occupying large spaces of these spaces, I feel like cheering. Because the truth is that in 2021, the gender gap is still huge and enormous. And is moving in two directions, both of which I hope we'll get around to talking about later. Twitter, even today, I think skews with about 68% male worldwide, with just about 31% of women online. So we're walking into environments that, even if they're not designed just for men, are sometimes quite aggressively inhabited by men.
Yeah.
And one thing that we've noticed very much on Indian Twitter is that aggression, as Kübra so wisely said, it's not just words on a screen. It's not just lines of text. What a lot of women have faced, from the journalist Rana Ayub to journalists like Anna Petticard, is being targeted for their religion. Rana is Muslim, Anna is Christian. And though all of us, anyone who speaks up against the Hindutva politics of today, we know that we're going to get a certain amount of blowback. But not just politics, it might be speaking up against the government, and that people who resent you having a strong voice are always going to come at you. But again, if you're a Muslim, if you are Dalit, if you are of a different race than white, or if you are non-binary, trans, LGBT in any way, the net is still a very, very uneasy space to negotiate. That's one side of it. And at the other side, I remember sitting there online as a young girl and just seeing, all these different selves join up and create a new space of freedom where I could be something different than what I was given in my own city. And that still exists, that map of networks, connections that we see. But I think what we also need to talk about a little bit is the possibilities within the peril. Both of them are absolutely true. I think in parenthesis, Urmi, one thing I want to say, I don't want to take this discussion too much into politics because we have, as Kübra beautifully said, the architecture of the internet to discuss. But I think this is a time when simultaneously you have women joining online. In India, rural women, again, have crossed a little bit of the gender gap, even though they're disadvantaged in terms of mobile phone penetration. But it's a dangerous time. It's an actively dangerous time to be online. Kübra spoke about activists for the climate being harassed. And sometimes it feels like, anyone who speaks out against autocracy, despotism, hatred, is at risk of very real world consequences in India. You could be jailed for something that you said on Twitter, or have cases filed against you, or literally have a mob at your door. And and there's also a tremendous amount of misogyny,
Yeah.
This is something I want to mention in brief, but I think I've already gone over time. But one of my most eye-opening experiences online was when I was briefly under the pen name of Hari Babu, which is a male name, drawn from Kipling's King. And I had a lot of conversations with men who were not necessarily openly hostile to women. But one of them said to me, he said, there's so many women coming onto this group, and don't they know it's designed for us? So I said, what's designed for us? And he said, this was again, late 1990s. And he said, the internet is designed by men for men. And I think some of that attitude still persists. It's something that I'm glad to say that we still push back against. And it's given me a lot of heart that, women, when they are given both the time and the actual resources, they get onto places like TikTok or Instagram and they use the net very creatively and very confidently. I'll shut up now and move back to Urmi.
But can I add a few things, Urmi, before you take over? Because I think, Nilanjana, you mentioned some beautiful aspects, and I didn't join as early as you did. So when I was in my teens, in 2003, 4, 5, we were using
we're just going with our ages now.
MSN, Messenger, remember those times? And then we had, these, like the blogosphere was amazing. And what happened there, and this is why for a very long time, I mostly saw the potential of the internet. And then it sort of shifted, and has to do with something you mentioned, Nilanjana. To me, it was the most empowering space. And to be allowed to cross class, gender boundaries, like spatial time boundaries even. I remember having had discussions with older men when I was just 14 years old on politics. And I don't know if they were older men, maybe they were also 13-year-old girls like me who pretended to be someone else. But so I remember having had all these very eye-opening discussions on the internet, and allowed me to politically actually reach out to people who had very different opinions than I had, to sort of, you grow through discourse, you grow through the interaction with people who are like-minded and who are, have a completely different outlook on the world. And what happened there was we were building a different net, and you said beautifully that you were mapping it together yourself. So you had much more control of the architecture around you. But then it shifted. I remember the first time on Facebook, I just talked about it to a friend the other day, when Facebook had introduced the algorithms, where you didn't see now chronologically what happened in your friend network, but then it curated it for you and you were still able to switch it off. And I remember how disturbed I felt by that, because why would they choose for me what I would think is important or not? And I felt, to me, it was a big disruption. And with this, I started to spend less and less time on that platform. But then, you mentioned this person who said, this space is designed for us. And it started to be designed for men. It started, there's this beautiful book by, her name is in my head. The title is Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble, I think. And what she does is highlight how the algorithms on Facebook, Google, Twitter are sort of part of a culture of oppression. For instance, she talks about how Google search images, when you Google professional hairstyle, you see hairstyle for blonde, white women, and unprofessional hairstyles are natural hairs of Black women. And also, when you were Googling for, I think Black girls, you would see pornographic pictures of young Black girls. And she showed the many forms of oppression that were perpetuated by these algorithms. And eventually, yes, this is what the architecture does. It perpetuates and manifests the pre-existing forms of oppression in our respective societies. And so I think it's a valid question we need to ask ourselves: who are these platforms designed for? Because all of these empowering constructive discourses that I had experienced previously to these algorithms taking over, those almost, they happen in a very reduced way. And the reason why, sorry, And the
I
reason,
said absolutely, that's all.
and the reason why all these creative usages of TikTok, for instance, I don't know if you've seen these TikTok videos of women doing makeup tutorials, but talking about politics. So they use these platforms creatively to put in content that is not supposed to be there. And they use all of this creatively because we women, marginalized people excluded, are used to look for creative ways to exist in an environment that is hostile to them. And one last
I agree with you. Sorry. Please talk.
Just one last thing. So, for instance, all these empowering workshops for women where they are being taught to talk basically like men, like stand like this, talk like this, make your point, and all of these things that we're being taught to feel empowered are basically taking over a male habitus that is ignorant and lacks humility. And the same happens on basically Twitter, for instance. You get certain attention, you get more outreach when you take on that toxic, destructive habitus. And if you behave the way the architecture wants you to behave. But if you don't want to be like that, please.
That's very astute, that sense of loss and all of that. And I'll hand this back to Urmi, but I'm so happy that Jyotsna and others in the comment section are mentioning Carolyn Criado Perez's Invisible Women, where it is, that sense of loss that all of us have from the blogs. I think the blogs put the controls in our hand. You were still in a world where parts of it might not have been safe or savory, but by and large, the sense of independence that you had, the sense of not being pushed around was much stronger. And I think I remember that also as a time when women's voices, as you said, Kübra, were not ironed out or evened out, into what you described. Urmi, what's it been like for you?
Not great. When you guys were talking about, just a space being designed for women, I was, in a very banal sense, thinking of something like the air conditioning. Like when I used to be somebody who worked in an office, I work independently now, so I have more control over the AC remote. But when I was in an office, I remember how much it used to annoy me that the office was always air conditioned to basically the male members, body temperatures. And so they never felt as cold as the women did. And it was always just like a place where they felt able to sort of control that and navigate that. And therefore, that wasn't listened to. Of course, we shut that down as best we could. We did that. But, coming off of a lot of what the two of you were discussing, and we're, of course, women who have some level of privilege and some level of access to the internet, to certain resources online. In such cases, how important would the both of you think, how important do you think it is for us to kind of create this solidarity or to bridge the gap even between marginalized communities online, so that we can sort of take on this rampant misogyny and patriarchy that there is online? Because, Nilanjana, as you know, in India, of course, there's this Hindutva sense of machismo that's very prevalent right now. We have Dalit and Adivasi women who don't have voices. We very recently had that really disturbing, that Muslim woman app that came out that was really, it was pretty traumatic to watch how women were pretty much put up for sale, quote unquote, and it was almost celebrated and definitely not condemned by the majority. So in such times, and of course even for you, Kübra, in a place, in a country like Germany, which has seen so much of an anti-immigrant wave, how important do you think it is to build those solidarity networks between women of color, trans individuals, gender non-conforming individuals, so that we can take the internet back? Yeah.
Kübra,
I'll hand it over to whoever wants to start.
Nilanjana, you start first this time.
Nilanjana, go for it.
I'll try to be brief. I remember the app you're talking about, Sudhi Deals, and it was both shocking and also very chilling, because there's two effects that it has on people when you basically put up an auction platform for Muslim women. One is that you're walking one step closer to genocide, and I have no hesitation in saying this. You're encouraging people to dehumanize, objectify, and demean women as a matter of fact, and you actually have used technology to build that in, right? And I get a little frightened because I don't see tech as value neutral. I see it as something with tremendous potential, but also we have to admit that it has a grim and very, tangled and powerful history of enabling a certain kind of hate, right? At this point, I honestly feel when I look at the internet and I see my own privilege out there as a kind of protective bubble around me. It's not that I'm free from the risk of, for example, a case being filed against me or something if I'm too outspoken. And we all know that in India, we are all self-censoring to some extent or the other, being far more careful about what we used to say than 15, 20 years ago. 7, 8 years ago is actually the point at which it changed. But I still have that little, level of privilege, or that large level of privilege that acts as a protective force around me. And I have often wondered if I was a woman in, coming out of not a big metro, but if I had a certain religious profile, a certain caste profile, would I be able to stand the internet? And by that, I mean the corporate built internet, the algorithm built internet, by and large, the Instagram, Facebook, Twitter triangle, which is what most people think of when they're talking about social media. Browsing the internet leads you to some great resources, but I think as a generation also, we've lost the ability to get off these platforms and discover the rest of the internet for ourselves. And I'm just going to keep it simple. I think at this point, the internet as we know it, particularly social media and social media platforms and apps, do not need to be tweaked and changed. They need a full and complete overhaul. In fact, there is an argument to be made that as it stands, it would be better for us if we really, raised the whole thing to the ground and started over again, thinking, how can you best empower the most vulnerable or the most voiceless in the community? And if it doesn't work for those people, then your internet is not really working for you. I remember something that happened on Twitter when Jack Dorsey and his team had come to India to make a visit. And he met a small group of women, I was among them. And one activist, I don't even want to name her because this is being recorded and I don't want to put her into danger, gave him as a gesture of goodwill a poster that said "Smash Brahminical Patriarchy." There was such a furor on the net from, the upper caste and politically motivated section of people that Twitter apologized to them, not seeing that they were disempowering Dalit women. And for a while during that period, Twitter became a space where if you were Dalit and were female online, you were mocked, threatened, dragged in that sense. So that kind of very, very medieval public cruelty has been built into those platforms. And I really think I've seen generation one of the internet, which had its benign side and its creative potential. I think as it stands, yes, the net still works as a platform where we can connect and have conversations like this. But if we really want to enable women to innovate, to be creative, to be their best selves, women and other, communities that in this very, very masculine built world, then I think we need to do a lot better. And I think we are ready for the internet phase 3. I think the way that it stands, the architecture as it stands, does not enable women at all.
Beautifully put, Nilanjana. I think one of the central points of what you said to me was that these social media platforms we were talking about, they don't need little tweaks and changes, but they need to be fundamentally changed. And I did a little survey a few weeks ago when, you remember, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram were all down. And the day after, I asked on Instagram if people felt happy about it. And the overwhelming majority, I think over 1,000 people were part of the survey, they said they were happy about it. And then I asked if they had wished these platforms would never open up again, and if they went down forever. And again, the overwhelming majority said, yes, they would prefer that. And then I asked why. And many of the answers people gave were things we do already talk about, such as these very absurd images of how a beautiful woman is supposed to look like, and these superficial images of people's lives that create the illusion of perfect bodies, perfect lives, perfect relationships, and how people feel not enough, whether as in their beauty or their lives, their professional success, their emotions, and like many reasons people gave why they were unhappy. And a lot of people also talked about how they felt disconnected from their immediate environment. And so many of the problems we're talking about. But then there were also people who said, you know, I am alone here without my family, and I need these platforms to be connected to my home because I can't travel there, because I can't, you know, people who are refugees, people who have fled, people who, you know, for different reasons had to leave their home to live in a different environment, and how they felt isolated by these platforms being down. And other people who are marginalized in their respective communities, who have found empowerment through the internet, who need these platforms, these different apps to survive, to inform themselves, to empower their minds, to stand what they experience on a daily basis. And to me, and I personally was very happy when these platforms were down, because I felt, just like Nilanjana, what you said, that these platforms don't need tweaks and changes, they need to be fundamentally reformed. And but then hearing this again reminded me of the potential. And I think the discussion we were supposed to have, but that we, at least in Germany and Europe, didn't have enough, was that the monopoly of these platforms, that is not supposed to exist. It is unnormal, it is destructive, it is toxic to have a uniform architecture that is supposed to fit to all these beautiful people all around the world. And if we had a more grassroots, more tweakable, more changeable, more organic environment, rather than having these solid, unmovable, thick barriers around us, this thick architecture that is very difficult to tweak and change. This is what we would need, actually, a more flexible, more human, more natural, more organic environment on the internet, just like us humans are. And this is, I think, what needs to fundamentally change, because anything we could now suggest in this environment to, create this room, create this chat, use this, blah, 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 are only little drops that won't make the change, because there needs to be structural and fundamental change. Because as Nilanjana said, these tweaks won't be enough.
Yeah. It's almost as if, the both of you kind of, even from different socio-political climates and different geographies, basically agree on the fact that the only way a woman today can exist online is in this very sanitized sort of version, the way she'd be allowed to exist, which is why we're talking about this fundamental overhaul in a lot of ways. But I want to ask you both, because I know you also hear a lot through some of the campaigns that you've done, essentially to hear from how marginalized communities, or how women who are socioeconomically underprivileged, how they interact with the internet. And Nilanjana, I know you started this really popular Twitter handle. I actually used to follow that, and one of my friends, Devanik, I think was with it for a while. So Gender Log is what it's called, and it was started after the Delhi bus gang rape. And it was, of course, really popular. And I know you talk about how you heard a lot from Dalit women, from trans individuals, and they always gave you certain experiences and accounts that perhaps you hadn't heard in that sense before, of how they interacted with the digital space. And even for you, Kübra, of course, when you started your hashtag, which talked about, basically looking at the racial aspect of sexism, it's definitely something to think about. Why in a lot of countries the debate about sexism is often intersected with a lot of racializing stereotypes. So I want to ask you both essentially what you heard, what that made you think about, and what you take away from what you heard from other people.
I'm so glad you brought up, this side of the internet as well, because I think even though a lot of us feel that constraint, it's like walking on hostile streets in the city, right? You're not going to let go of your freedom or your ability to be out there, but it means that there is that much effort. And Genderlog, I have to give the credit to people like Natasha Badwar and, Amrita Tripathi and others who kept it going. Because Nupur Tripadi, these were the three people who really, really kept that handle going after I had to step back after the first couple of years when I've got a little busier. It came up basically as just a space to archive a lot of the conversations that were happening after those very wrenching protests, where women came together in December 2012 to protest the terrible rape and murder of this young woman in the heart of Delhi, and to basically demand justice, but also to demand change, to just say that we are fed up of being prisoners in our own lives. From there, one of the reasons why it evolved was because Nupur, Natasha, and Amrita remained very responsive to the early criticism that this was a handle. Who was it for? There's certain wariness. Is this again going to be just upper class feminists? And so they reached out and tried to diversify the speakers. And Genderlog was basically experimental. Every week we handed over the Twitter handle to a different person or a different group. And as a result, because everybody was learning from everybody else, there was a kind of flatness, a kind of equality built into it. Nobody was sitting there top down being the controller. Every now and then, I think for me, it was a very humbling experience to understand how much of the feminist or the younger women's movements I hadn't even known about. And I often just sat back and learned. The other thing that I learned was twofold. Okay, one is I don't mean to be mean to men, but I remember, this moment when several well-meaning men were completely baffled when they were asked to step back, continue to listen to the handles, but to hand over the mic, as in, not speak so much and let women speak. And it was a moment of mutual bewilderment. The women could not understand why the men could not do this simple thing, until we all realized that men are socialized to believe, in India at least, that if they participate in something, that must be active participation. Women, on the other hand, are almost overtrained into believing that listening and listening carefully and being a supportive person is what you need to do. And so once you could see it in plain sight and you could say, no, having you there, not speaking but listening, is also incredibly valuable. Both sides could stand down a little bit. But the other was in the middle of Genderlog going on, and the handle, sometimes we got it wrong, sometimes people got online and said all kinds of things, and you had Twitter fights and all of that. But I think it did start to show us how vast the universe of women online on Twitter was. And how when you gave somebody a space, or when you created a space, rather, you don't give that space, you just create it and stand back. If you create the right kind of space for women and anyone else who is otherwise not visible and not seen, it is astonishing what they can accomplish. And it's astonishing how clear and firm their voices are. And I was reminded, of the two ways in which technology can work. In Uttarakhand, for example, women often get together and they'll use 3 cell phones among a group to get onto the farming commodities market. And in a parallel sort of way, that channel, where they're talking about crop prices or they're talking about what they've grown, etc., became a little bit of a lifeline for women in a certain set of villages. The younger women were told that if they were facing domestic violence or domestic abuse in the families that they had newly married into, they should just type, "Is it going to rain tomorrow?" And that became a kind of little signal. So when you think of innovation, I think that a lot of stuff is, we are agile. We used as a group of women, and I mean to include more than just women in this group, we used to functioning under threat. But we're chafing because I think we do want, and I've often wondered about this, and I wonder whether you too, Kübra, of course, you have to respond to this question. But what would an internet that really enabled women to be their most creative and most innovative be like? Just a thought.
I love this question because I'm currently thinking about how world look like who enabled that. And I don't have an answer yet, but while doing my field research for this book that I'm about to write, one of the things that stood out to me, and I don't have an answer to this question, but I was looking for places where already people are trying to live by the ideals that we all proclaim to have. And in one of those spaces, which is a feminist, anti-capitalist, anarchist group, women-led. So in Germany, most of the anarchist groups that I have been familiar with were very patriarchal, male-dominated spaces. And what stood out to me in that space, female-led, was how observant everyone was. When you talked about listening, how important listening was. So if someone, for instance, someone wouldn't say out loud that they had a problem, but they would observe each other in a way where they would say, for instance, they mentioned a man was part of their group and he was walking differently than he used to. And then they asked, or one person asked, so is there a problem? Do you want to tell me something? There appears to be something different about the way you walk. And this person admitted that he was in pain due to a health issue. His foot hurt. He wasn't able to pay the doctors to get treatment. And this is why he was walking differently. And then they said, okay, let's, collect some money and pay for it together. So to enable for you to be able to walk. So in an environment where normally you are forced to ask for help, they create an environment where you don't even need to do that because people are so observant. In German, we have this word zugewandt, which means to lean towards someone. So it's sort of like, a relationship where people don't need to lean in, but everyone leans to everyone so that you are comforting each other. And it really had an impact on, and they said they believe centralized government is not suitable to human beings, not on that scale, not have millions of people being cared by one institution that creates norms, health norms, beauty norms, tries to standardize these beautiful human beings that are different. And, we change within a day, we change within our lifetimes. And they asked this question, and I wondered, there's a storm happening in Hamburg right now, so don't worry about all the sound, and there's a lot of thunder and rain happening right now. And it made me wonder, is it possible to have a standardized, centralized system that is supposed to enable everyone to flourish in? I don't have an answer to this, but I doubt that. And I think it's important to think about the question, if it's not, what do we need as an alternative? But to your question, Urmi, I think what I also find problematic in the current system we're having is even feminist spaces replicate the toxic behavior that we're fighting against. And there's this beautiful, quote, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tool. And then we have what the architecture of, for instance, Twitter and Facebook does in our discourse is to dehumanize your people who have a different opinion than you have, to view them as a monolith, like a homogenized group where everyone is the same, and you fight against that, and you don't. And then you choose the most absurd position as your counterpart, and you attack that person with the most, stupid, absurd, easily to be attacked position. And that, I think, is a problem, because if you want to have a constructive discourse, you need to acknowledge that people who oppose you are also people, that you might agree with them on certain things and you might disagree inherently on other things. And that, and I'm not talking about, having a different opinion whether certain people should exist or not. I'm not talking about, fundamental human rights, but within this framework, we need to have constructive discourse, and I don't see that happening. And I have a huge problem with critical spaces copying toxic behavior that they claim to fight against. And I think this is due to the structure of the internet that we inhabit. We become people who talk like this because we're encouraged to talk like that. And so what I hope for is that despite all of this, we might be able to create offline and online spaces where we are allowed to doubt, make mistakes to learn from them, where we're allowed to think, where we're allowed to take a position we usually wouldn't take, just to find out if it might improve our point, so that we're able to have sustainable, long-lasting solutions to the very important topics we are discussing. And this is something that makes me hopeful. And I know a lot of people are working on that. And I think we need more of this.
I really want to, in this discussion, at this point, bring in the fact that a lot of the reasons that this exists online is because it most certainly exists offline. And so I want to talk about the structural inequalities that we're already faced with before we even reach the internet. Right now, and it happened really late, and Kübra, you can tell me what it was like for you in Germany, but at least here in India, our mothers and grandmothers didn't really get to Facebook or Twitter till much later. And, when they did, it was looked at as this really humorous sort of indication that, there are these really middle-aged and elderly women now somehow trying to thumb through their feeds and trying to navigate this space, etc. But, they've also, but I see how ecstatic they often feel at being able to access something that wasn't there a generation ago. And so I want to talk about where you see that structural, how do you think we can dismantle that? And where do we how do we bring that into the internet? Because when we look at our households, they're not exactly equitable spaces. There's unpaid domestic labor. There's, I love that story that you just shared, Nilanjana, of the women in Uttarakhand who, if they faced marital rape, would just type in, "Is it going to rain?" Because that was the only way they could get the story of their abuse out without anybody suspecting it. So those are some really real issues that women already face in developing countries, in third world countries, in marginalized countries, where the internet is still kind of confined to a place where some women, very few women, kind of have access to. So how do we expand that space, and how do we break those structural inequalities? What do the two of you suggest?
I was looking at the questions, and there was two from Jyotsna Narasimhan, where she says, could you share your thoughts on the paradox of the visibility, where we are targeted, being marginalized, but we are visible, versus anonymity for the abusers in the tech space? And the second question was, how do we respond to being boxed a certain way? For it's human to categorize things in people. So how can we unbox and deal with this problematic
so Nilanjana, we'll actually take those questions right after the audience.
Okay, I was just interested in, because I think some of these questions, some of the other questions are also pointing to everybody's frustration. We all sense that, to me, I don't know whether there's such a thing as an ideal internet. I think it's as utopian in the sense of the dreams that so many of us have of a near perfect world where we are paying attention to climate change and we try very hard to change the normal structures of capitalism into something that is more wholesome for the planet and wholesome for all of us. But I think that if decentralizing the internet is becoming more and more imperative, and at the same time, a certain point of us is stuck, because the internet as we know it, and particularly again, Twitter, Facebook, all of that, they mimic the power structures of the real world. A very important point that you've been making all through, Urmi, is that there is nothing online that is not in some ways a reflection, even if it's a slightly different reflection and a speeding up of what's happening in the online world. So we just take power structures up there and replicate it. And Muda just pointed out that she was thinking about TikTok and how the former was briefly more egalitarian in the Indian context, and then it was shut down. But I think in those little flickers, you have the blogs from the past, you have something like TikTok from the present. These are little pointers, a service like Mastodon. I think for a lot of people, leaving the open social networks, even for me, leaving is not difficult, it's not easy, because I can't carry my network over there. And because in order to have the privilege of being safe, I also lose the power of being part of a much larger sphere. And that's a constant tension with a lot of us. But I think these three things, if I might wrap them neatly, one is decentralization. Two is, instead of the algorithm-driven world where you're looking at a successful network in terms of numbers and clicks and engagement and profits, if you looked at it really in terms of liberation and innovation, I think your perspective would change. If when you were creating a new social network or any kind of space online, you were saying, how does this work to free up users to be potentially their best selves, or to have the kind of conversations that Kübra is talking about, where you can disagree, but that disagreement does not turn lethal or have terrifying consequences for either side, right? And the third part of it is something we haven't discussed yet, but it's the nature of tech itself, right? It's not been an industry that has welcomed or been open to not just women, but it has not been very diverse as an industry, as a hiring policy, and it has not welcomed a certain worldview, So I think, again, we're seeing that you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. But if you're looking at a corporate environment in other parts of the world, corporations have been responsive and have changed. And I don't lose hope, We think of Silicon Valley as a very, big brother, bro code, masculine industry in the worst possible way. And we think of it as very capitalist. If you remove those two and you introduce a different set of corporate values, could you have something different? And I'd love to see an internet built by women. As somebody said, feminism is not necessarily a term that appeals to all women. But what would a truly women-built internet look like? And again, we don't know. And I'm curious about all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it puts us into to face a reality, and that is that our ideals are not part of the reality. And as you said, Nilanjana, the internet replicates what is present online. And I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, I think Microsoft did a test on Twitter where they had this account, artificial intelligence account that was supposed to learn from human beings, and within 24 hours they had to cancel it because it was just using swear words and like cursing and being extremely racist and sexist, because this is what this account had learned from interacting with human beings on the internet, on Twitter. And there are, for instance, initiatives where they try to create a feminist data set so that the artificial intelligence can learn from that data set. But it puts us into an inherent problem that the internet, these platforms, artificial intelligence learns from the present system that we fight against. So it replicates it. And then we end up fighting against the replication, but it copies what is there. So a feminist or more feminist, female-led sort of initiative would have to first create a data set that these machines can learn from so that it comes closer to ideals. So there's the problem with that, like the internet is a replication, or maybe even a more dense sort of replication of what is there as a problem in the present. But and this is where activism comes in. I mean, people who are activists who they see the potential in the present. They don't just settle with what is being offered to them as your rights, your possibilities, but they see the potential of having a different life, more equal, more just, more in tune, etc., etc. One other thing I wanted to talk about, because I know, Urmi, you asked about it, and I think I sort of just didn't answer it, and that is, these campaigns, they have, especially now that in recent years you've had many more people of different demographics join in the internet and these discourses. So what happened is, for instance, with the campaigns Xiaohin, and then we had other campaigns in Germany on racism on a daily basis, that most people in Germany, when you talked about racism, they would associate it, so this was a few years ago, with neo-Nazis and with openly blunt racism, where people had this as an active ideology that they chose. But they would not associate it with things that happened on a daily basis. They would not associate it with things that happened in the center of our societies. They would associate it with the margins. And these campaigns prove that you don't need to have a huge incident like people being murdered, houses burning, a terror attack to talk about racism. But what's happening on a daily basis is enough of a problem to talk about. And this allowed us to have a more, to center the structures rather than in an individual event where you could then also say, oh no, it happened differently than what you told, to try and divert the attention from the structural to one incident and have that as the center of the discussion. So it allowed us to have the structure at the center of the discussion, and it also allowed for people who have been objectified, who experience racism personally, to actually see it in that light. A lot of women were talking about how through these campaigns, they realized that what had happened to them was not an individual incident, not, just misfortune or bad luck, or that they misinterpreted a certain situation, but that there was a structure behind this, and that there's a word for it: sexual harassment, microaggression, daily racism. And these words helped even people who don't have access to certain discourses to find words to describe what they have been experiencing on a daily basis. So these campaigns in the last years, I think, for millions of people around the world, have been part of an awakening. And that is to see the problems and cracks in our structures, in our norms that oppress and dehumanize entire groups of people.
That is so powerful. And Urmi, I know you have to go, but I was just wondering, I'm sorry, I'm just stepping in because I don't want you to leave without saying.
Go ahead.
But you remember how powerful Me Too, was in India, which was started again by Raya Sarkar.
Yeah.
And it was started by somebody who was not from mainstream upper caste feminism in India.
Yeah.
And it just took on an extraordinary power and force. I think it takes a lot of time to change structures of injustice, particularly gender injustice. But I remember how just being heard or just being able to speak one's truth was an incredibly moving and I think very, very empowering moment for a lot of us. Even though, women are still, there's been a backlash, there's been a severe backlash, and a lot of people who spoke out have discovered that they have been at the receiving end of harassment afterwards. But I was just wondering if you wanted to speak about that as an example of what the internet, even in its present form, can enable. Because
for sure, Nilanjana, like what you talk about, it was certainly a really heartening thing to see. And I think it always makes you feel really empowered as a woman online when you see sort of like the space being taken back. And I know you and I were talking about it a little bit before this, where we spoke about the Me Too movement, which was one of those little examples where this one pebble really created a big splash. And it began in 2017 with Raya talking about it, and then it spilled over in 2018. So that wasn't a movement that was very easy to quash, And as somebody who in 2018, along with several female journalists and, leftist women kind of spoke about their own experiences of sexual abuse. And I was one of them. I found the internet at the time this really powerful tool of solidarity, because it was a place where you could share resources and you could just essentially feel really empowered, because you felt it was one of those unique examples where you knew that structurally, perhaps outside in the external world, maybe a lot wouldn't happen. But right now, at this time, you were being able to create some change, which would eventually kind of peter out and kind of, follow some more change outside. So that was really incredible to see. But on that note, Nilanjana, you and Kübra have raised some very important points today, and we've actually had a multitude of questions and comments coming in from audience. I mean, that's really been incredible to see. It's multiple scrolls on my chat box. So I'm going to hand that over to Lasya. Lasya, if you want to take over with all the questions that we have today. And it's been great chatting with the both of you. And thank you so much.
Thank you
so much, Urmi.
Thank you, Urmi. That was a wonderful session. I loved listening in to every minute of it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Kübra. Hi, Nilanjana. It was great to listen to you, and I loved all the invisible women fangirling that happened. I was actually, I know that some of the questions you read out already, Nilanjana, but I will probably start off with the Q&A box here. And before I jump in, we have exactly 20 minutes left on the session. So the audience, if you have any questions, I request you to please leave them in the Q&A box for the authors to answer. So I'm just going to go into Jyotsna Narsimhan's question about something very interesting, actually. With artificial intelligence and machine learning, etc., do you think the bias is going to widen, given that we still have less representation, be it at decision-making levels or otherwise? I think this question is primarily about algorithmic bias and can we really correct it anymore, since it has been created, the codes have been created for generations now. Does anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I think Safia Umaya Noble, who wrote this, she was one of the first to actually highlight this and base it on her research. And she is still doing that. She's now become a professor, I think, I don't know which city, to be honest. And yes, there were improvements. After her criticism, Google did tweak their algorithms on Google search images. But yes, I mean, you probably all remember these news. I think a few years ago, IBM's facial recognition cameras were unable to recognize the faces of Black men, and even less likely the faces of Black women. And it was never tested. And that was due to it never being tested on Black men and Black women. And then, or I think it was, I forgot which company it was, but they did not hand out soap. The soap dispenser did not hand out any soap to the hands of Black people because it was never tested on them. So I think we are able to save it by deliberately creating data sets that come closer to our ideals, so that we don't choose just the present as what we want to replicate, but choose our ideals as what we want to replicate. What we want to replicate. I mean, our constitutional rights are not, they don't describe reality. Our laws don't describe reality. The rules that our respective governments have as their foundations, they don't describe reality. They describe ideals. Yeah. But if we choose the present as our rules, our norms, we won't come closer to ideals. So there is an inherent problem, and this is why it's important to create feminist, anti-racist, etc., say data sets.
Yeah,
I think Kübra put it very well, and I just want to add one thing to that. I've forgotten what the exact percentage was, but I think it's only as low as 15% or 12% of researchers into machine learning are women. That's it, you know. And when you start to peel it back and you ask yourself, you know, where is all of this coming from? I think the more we start to delve into structures, the more we see that the future is, you know, a little nerve-wracking. Increasingly, what I'm thinking is that one, in a slightly more forgiving way, I see the internet still as very, very young, you know. The internet as we know it, the World Wide Web as we know it, is barely a few decades old. And it is unfortunately making a lot of the mistakes that pretty much any corporatized structure has done. But a new debate that started to come up in the corporate world, people are reminding each other that in the oldest definition of corporations, a corporation is supposed to be part of a community and part of a company's respectability, if you like. This is slightly idealized, you know, and it doesn't take into account the brutal realities of trade and colonialism. But at least there was a time when certain companies believed that they had a responsibility to give back to a certain place and community. And so I see two things that need to be addressed. One is structural. If you don't have women, if you don't have people of diverse races and diverse, you know, gender orientations working on machine learning, then sooner or later you will discover the limitations of what you're creating. And that has very, very dystopian, you know, consequences for us. Something that we saw in India, for example, with even something like a digital ID, Aadhaar, is how many women it leaves out of the simple basic system of being able to collect your rations and stay free of starvation. So these things have real world consequences. But I'm a little forgiving about this. I think we are in literally the first generation of the algorithmic internet. I do not see a bright, shining future. I do see that we're going to go through a fair amount of dystopia before we get anywhere better. But at least the awareness that there is a problem and that it needs to be fixed is there. What Jyotsna says is true, though. The future of AI learning has a huge, huge set of question marks over it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's wonderful that you mentioned that, because I was on one of those infamous Clubhouse rooms a while ago, and the discussion was about what role AI has to play in policy in the future, in governing and policy. And it was a bunch of people just saying, yeah, it's going to take over. It's the right way to go, etc., etc. And incidentally, it was all white men saying that. And then there are black people who came on and said, listen, there are so many people excluded out of this, and they were like, no, you know what, we'll find solutions. And I'm just like sitting there, and I'm just like, this is not going to really, who is making the space all over again? The next question is also from Jyotsna Nilanjana. I don't know if you read it slightly earlier partially, but this is more about, could you also please kindly share your thoughts on the paradox of visibility, where we are targeted or being marginalized, versus anonymity of the abusers in the tech space? That's so very interesting.
I'm so happy that Jyotsna raised this, because initially anonymity online was meant to be a protective force. The thought behind it was something like people in countries like Turkey or Egypt or parts of the United States, anywhere where they're facing a certain kind of government scrutiny, should have the ability to be anonymous. And anonymity was also, it was built into the net version 1. But I think there's a case to be said for a limited anonymity where you have to explain why you want that, because it's definitely been abused, right? It's not just been abused. I think it has become one of the biggest grounds for abuse in India. When you come to the most toxic trolls, when you come to some of the worst handles, we're facing a crisis of hate speech and hate thought in many ways across the country. And anonymity enables people to do that without consequences. It's another matter that there are very, very few consequences for people who do identify themselves. But I think it is uneasy. It is definitely a problem area. And, while we have privacy laws, I think what most women find when they try to speak out about something, or activists, as Kübra mentioned earlier, their visibility becomes a two-edged sword. I would add to that a third problem, which is again structural and has a lot to do with the way social media works. There's the speed at which things change and at which you find that you are part of the soap opera of the day. And behind that, whatever controversy of the day is happening, the mincing machine that is grinding down somebody's life into little shreds, or the heat directed at somebody over a period of a week or so, that machine will move on, but that person's life is sitting there in shreds. And I think this is one of the effects of tech that we're talking about, but we are not exploring enough. Technology on its own does not have kindness built into it, right? It does not have consideration. It does not have the sense of community built into it. So let me turn it around and say it's not just about anonymity and visibility. Visibility, I understand a lot more in class and caste terms. I find it uncomfortable sometimes that, women like me, I feel that we should step back a little bit from discussions, even good discussions like this, and we should hand over the mic more often and not just have upper caste Indian feminist voices speaking all the time. Because not, out of a sense of acknowledging one's privilege and doing the right thing. It's not about us. It's more about you are not seeing a full picture if you do not have multiple voices in the room. And at the moment, we don't. So, even that visibility, I think a lot of that visibility is going to celebrities online or people with very high follower counts. And I have the wonderful experience personally, on a lighter note, of having, for some reason that I've never understood, a very high follower count on Twitter and a very comfortably low follower count on Instagram. So Twitter brings out my pompous side and Instagram cuts me nicely down to size, and I think everybody should have a life like that. But more seriously, visibility has become a celebrity game, and everybody on the internet is encouraged to go for that celebrity. It's become almost a currency, in the attention economy. I find the attention economy, again, one of the scariest outcomes of tech. I could go on about this, but I'd better shut up because I think we're running short on time, and we do want to, have both of you.
I love this question, and I loved your answer, Nilanjana. It made me think about, those times where anonymity was much more celebrated. And as you said, it had a very different intention back then. But we then shifted into a time where, I wouldn't say it's visibility or anonymity, it's anonymity versus accountability. And since the platforms don't feel responsible or take on the responsibility of accountability, people are forced into being visible with their true identities to then be able to protect themselves, or they ask for visibility of those people who misuse anonymity to seek accountability. So I think this is where the true problem lies. These platforms don't take their responsibility seriously. They don't hold people accountable for the misuse that is happening on their platforms. And they then push people into seeking visibility and demonizing anonymity, which I think is a beautiful thing. And I'm going to tell why in a minute, so that accountability is able to take place. But the problem lies with the lack of accountability by the companies behind these different various platforms. And then on visibility, it comes with a price. And there is there are certain processes that allow you to be visible. And I remember back in the days, I would oftentimes deactivate my Facebook account because I didn't like the way it changed the way I wrote, the way I interacted. I didn't like the buzz around me that because back in the days when we were discussing topics and forums, it was about the topic. And Facebook, Twitter made it more about the people. And they were centered. It became people-centered rather than discourse-centered. And I disliked that because I didn't want to adorn myself with the opinions I have and had. I wanted to be able to change. I wanted to be able to have conflicting opinions because I am a human being and I change constantly. This is who we are. And one essay by a writer, again, I don't remember her name, I'm going to look it up for you if you want later on. She said one of the biggest achievements of a liberal society is that you as a human being are allowed to have different identities. So she was talking about having a different identity at church, at work, with your friends, with your family, But these platforms strip you away of all these different identities. You're forced into one, a homogeneous one, but we're not that. We're not who we pretend to be on the internet. And it strips away these facets of yours, the quirky you, the intelligent you, the funny you, the pessimistic you, the optimistic you, all of yous merged into one that is not you. And this is dehumanizing because this is not who we are. So and because again, so this is the last point. One of the quotes that made me rethink the way we use the internet and how I, as an activist back then, worked was by Nietzsche, who said, if you make a living by chasing your enemy, you have an interest in keeping him alive. And, I was like talking about racism and I was getting attention for it. And this was, you know, as you said, Nilanjana, the currency, attention is currency. So I said, you know, I don't want to be dependent on racism getting worse, on sexism getting worse, on things getting worse, because I perpetuate it. I, at the end of my life, want to look back and say, I'm lucky none of the things I predicted happened. And there's no, what was the word? There's no glory in prevention. You know, in the pandemic, all these scientists who successfully prevented certain things from happening were later on attacked because those things didn't happen. There is no glory in it, but we should seek that. And but these platforms don't want us to do that. They want us to live off by things going worse, and we perpetuate it. But this is why, despite all these structures and systems, we need to create spaces where we live by our ideals. And that is extremely difficult, but possible. And so I think what we need to then do is, if we're visible, don't play by the rules. And it's very difficult, but it's possible.
I think that's so beautifully said. And I know we've got more questions, but I just wanted to add one little thing to that, which is that in the writing space, I become a worse writer if I'm on the, what I think of as the majoritarian neoliberal internet too long. You know, then I become kind of like either a ranting machine or I'm thinking in hashtags, if you know what I mean, you know. And I found that when in the last year, speaking from a very selfish point of view, when I stepped back and gave myself breaks, I still like, you know, some of the connective parts of Twitter. I love the part where I'm exposed to voices or conversations from parts of the world or parts of India that I would not otherwise be able to hear. But I find that when I'm my truest self and when I'm doing my best work, I'm often either off social media and these platforms that we've been talking about. I've been very happy in certain other corners of the internet. I've been very happy in digital archives, you know, in libraries. I have a very nerdy sense of self. And often the libraries and the archives is also where I rediscover the history of the women who came before me, as thinkers, as scholars, as scientists, as writers, as politicians, as innovators. And those are quieter, you know, not glamorous worlds. But my experience of the internet would be weaker without that. And if I was to say one thing to, you know, women from whatever background who are getting online today, it's before you step into social media and before you get swept up in that endless tidal current, you know, which rewards you with a kind of fake love, a kind of fake following, a kind of fake, you know, prominence. Find out who you are on the rest of the internet. You know, find out what the other side of there is so much to the internet as such. For me, it's digital archives and, you know, newspaper libraries and all of that. For somebody else, it might be finding different communities. It might be finding the right kind of mailing lists, and that becomes a lifeline. It might be finding resources. And I think I constantly now want to remind people that the internet exists as a very, very wide and sometimes unexplored space. And some parts of that can actually make you more the person that you want to be and truer to yourself, rather than take you away from yourself.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Nilanjana and Kübra, both. I loved the answers from both of you. I think we have many more questions coming in, but I would maybe wrap this up and take like two parting statements from the both of you. And I think most of these questions are hinting at one thing. And everybody, including Lydia, Muda, and Jyotsna, have been pointing out things about Facebook, the metaverse, how Zuckerberg started it and why he started Facebook. And that's something Lydia pointed out. And Muda was pointing about the more recent incident. Where do we see ourselves going? Do we need an alternate universe? Where do women fit into the internet going forward? What kind of spaces can we create to create that solidarity? Or how do you see women and innovation and internet going forward? Where would you like this to be? Very brief.
I I'll just come in with a very quick thing.
Yeah.
And first, I want to say thank you to all of you, Lasya, you and everyone at Belong, but everyone who's participated in this conversation, because it's really opened it up for us, and it's made me for sure, think about other things. I'm an incurable optimist, actually. I think disillusionment is productive. And when we come to the understanding, as I think Lydia has said, that Zuckerberg invented Facebook on his university campus for his crowd to have a platform for talking about girls, or has, Muda has asked at different point, how do we handle the divisions within an otherwise strong and positive movement? She was talking about that with regard to Me Too, which again, has a caste divide and a class divide running down it. And I look at all of that imperfection, and I think a lot of our salvation depends on not just accepting meekly that this is the way the internet is supposed to be. When I'm disappointed with social media, my way, because I'm not a techie, is to just get off it and find something better. But I think the demand to build not a better internet, but a more evolved internet, right? And one that is also responsive to the needs of half of humanity, for Christ's sake. How long do we have to say that might actually be important? So if that means that we need to ask that we break down a whole set of structures, capitalism is one of them, the tech world is one of them. The way we do business needs to change fundamentally. And I can only hope that this becomes, a more and more powerful movement, and that those of us who are disillusioned turn away from this, relentless machine and refuse to become decent little sausages or decent little, chicken patties or whatever it is, mold it into one little shape, like ice cream cones of the same shape. We're not. And I would like to see an internet come about that pays homage to everything that we are and can be and should be.
Thank you so much, Nilanjana. Kübra?
Yeah, just to add on, Nilanjana, what you've been saying about a more evolved internet, I think what we need to build is a constantly evolving, responsive place that is changing on the go, learning on the go, striving towards ideals, because this world where all our ideals, our reality doesn't exist yet, and we don't even know what it would look like, what it would smell like, what it would be shaped like, what it would feel like, and we need to explore it. And for that, we need to be able to do mistakes. We need to be able to learn from our mistakes. We need to be able to grow. We need to be able to look at it from a completely different perspective, to run around and watch the world from all different angles and perspectives. And what is the future? The future is nothing than the consequence of now. And if we don't live, this other world is not just going to happen to us. It's not going to fall down from the sky. It is followed by inaction in now. And one quote that really made me rethink how this future comes about was one of the key advisors of George W. Bush, the former US president. He said in an interview with Ron Suskind by the New York Times that he says, when we act, meaning the US government, when we act, we create realities, and those you will study. And while you study those realities, we'll act again, creating new realities. And this is how things will be put into order. We are history's actors, and all of you will be just left to study what we do. This quote is perfect because it shows us that by acting now, creating other realities, we can change and shift dynamics. And this, for instance, happened in Germany, unbeknownst to most, by many feminist activists speaking differently. We chose to speak a more feminist language on a daily basis rather than asking for permission to do it. And now one of the some news anchors on national TV use feminist language. It didn't happen because we asked for permission. It didn't ask because we made a campaign for it. We just did it. And as a consequence, it happened. Reality is what we do. And all of these, we think back to the architecture of the internet. I mean, yes, there's an architecture, but yes, it can be gone within a minute. We choose to live by these borders. We can choose to not do it. So yeah, living the future we hope to live in one day now will bring about change.
Oh, thank you so much. That was the perfect end I could imagine, the most perfect end I could imagine. And thank you so much, Nilanjana, Kübra. This was amazing. I kind of feel like we should have monthly town hall sessions just to discuss this, because this is never going to end. This was the most splendid, enriching conversation. Thanks for everybody else who contributed. Thank you, Lydia, for staying back at the panel and listening in. Thank you, Jyotsna. Thank you, Muda. Thank you, everybody who has been actively participating in this conversation. Like Nilanjana said, it has really, I'm sure it has really helped the panel speak more diverse topics. I'd also like to thank Urmi, who was here earlier, for moderating the session and asking such beautiful questions. And thank you to Goethe for bringing Kübra here. Thank you, Nilanjana, for joining us, and thank you, Kübra, again for joining us. It was absolute delight listening to you. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. I'm saying so much thank you because it was absolutely delightful to just listen in.